We often believe that reinventing ourselves requires a dramatic upheaval. We imagine cinematic exits, burning bridges, and grand gestures that signal the beginning of a new life. But perhaps the most profound transformations are not thunderous events. They are whispers. They begin in private moments, before the world has even woken up enough to demand anything from us. Consider the ritual of the morning mirror. Most people look into those glass depths with efficiency. They check for sleep lines, brush away imperfections, or assess their presentation for the coming day. But what if we stopped seeing merely ourselves? What if we saw something deeper, a kind of accumulated exhaustion etched into the very landscape of our eyes? The looking glass becomes an uncomfortable mirror indeed. It does not reflect only bone and skin. It reflects time, indecision, and the countless times we have chosen the path of least resistance. In those depths, we are forced to confront a self that feels deeply unlived. This is where the journey must start, with acknowledging the distance between who we feel we should be and who simply exists when the morning light first hits our face. The automatic rhythm of life, waking up, commuting, performing necessary tasks, is often one fueled by habit, not intention. We move through motions that were assigned to us, rather than those generated from a deep core sense of purpose. We are running on someone else's schedule, operating under the mistaken belief that compliance equals contentment. The weight we carry in our spirits is far heavier than any physical burden. It is the unseen load of expectations, the expectation of professional success by our parents, the expectation of perpetual happiness from our peers, the internal mandate to always be productive and visible online. We become masters at wearing masks. We perfect the performance of the good life in the public square, the perfectly filtered memory, the impeccably structured career update, the effortless laughter shared across a dinner table. Yet, behind that practiced smile lies an exhausted recognition, a knowing silence about how little of this entire edifice actually belongs to us. This mirroring process is inherently uncomfortable because discomfort, contrary to popular thought, is where awareness lives. It pulls us out of the comforting stupor of autopilot and forces a genuine examination. We must resist the urge to simply glaze over what we see. That denial only strengthens the illusion. Instead, we embrace the sheer vulnerability of being utterly seen by ourselves. The first act of reinvention is therefore not an action in the world, but a pause within it. It requires us to interrupt the current flow, to hit the mental stop button on the torrent of shoulds and musts. This stillness is revolutionary. In the middle of the chaos, the overflowing inbox, the screaming traffic, the relentless chatter of expectation, we must learn to simply be present for one full breath. Just a single, intentional intake and release. This pause is not idleness. It is gathering ground. It is reclaiming sovereignty over our attention. In that minute of suspended time, we begin to feel the deep difference between responding reactively and choosing thoughtfully. We start understanding that much of our inner turmoil is not caused by external events, but by our immediate, uncontrolled reaction to those events. The mirror does not judge us for this realization, which is key. It simply reflects what is, without embellishment or pity. And in accepting the raw data point of what is, we diminish its power to dictate our future trajectory. We are taught from childhood that value resides in external markers: salary, relationship status, degree achieved. The mirror forces us to ask a harder question. Where does true value reside? In what we possess, or in how we choose to simply occupy the space of being? This deep confrontation with self is daunting because it exposes all our comfortable lies. It shows us the small ways we have surrendered agency over decades, the compromises made for approval, the ambitions deferred for perceived stability. We realize that by agreeing to these invisible weights, we were inadvertently trading the richness of a potentially authentic life for the perceived safety of routine. The weight of expectation is rarely a single burden. It is an interwoven tapestry of external voices. The nagging voice of comparison, the gentle but firm hand of familial obligation, the booming loudspeaker of cultural success. And until we identify those specific threads, they remain invisible constraints on our movement and growth. Reinvention, therefore, begins not with grand solutions or massive overhauls, but with radical honesty. It is learning to look into that uncomfortable mirror and whispering, quietly at first, not this life, not exactly this person, but something else, something rooted in what truly echoes within my own core. The work of self-discovery is simply the labor of staring straight ahead until your own face stares back with a flicker of recognition, a flicker suggesting potential. We have learned to look inward, confronting the silent expectations that shape our days. We examined the weight of external judgments, those invisible burdens we accumulate from society and from others who believe they know best. But recognizing a burden is only the first step. It does not mean we are free simply because we acknowledge its presence. The true challenge lies in the act of setting down what was never truly ours to carry. The human mind, by its very design, seeks patterns. We mistake predictability for stability and busyness for purpose. Our greatest temptation is to assume that the momentum of life, the race from one appointment to the next, the constant scroll through curated perfection, is synonymous with a fulfilling existence. We rush past moments, treating them as mere transitions between more important tasks. Yet, it is precisely in these small, unremarkable pauses, in the spaces we tend to overlook, that the seeds of genuine change take root. Consider the subtle tyranny of the clock. It dictates our waking hours, structures our ambition into metrics of measurable success. We learn to measure self-worth not by inherent value, but by productivity units. To be valuable is to constantly output. To pause is to risk being forgotten, inefficient, or merely. Still, this systemic pressure creates a constant low hum of anxiety. The fear that if we stop generating effort, we cease to exist in the eyes of others. The weight of expectations, therefore, is not built from grand pronouncements or dramatic failures. It is constructed from thousands of tiny, acceptable compromises. It is choosing the expected career path over the curious one, nodding agreement in a discussion even when feeling nothing but dissonance, posting an image that looks happy while experiencing profound internal fatigue. These compromises are rationalized. We tell ourselves that we are being dutiful, that we are being sensible, or that we must participate to belong. But adherence to external scripts demands an enormous tax on the soul, a steady draining of our authentic energy. The cost is a deeply ingrained sense of misalignment, a nagging feeling that the life lived does not match the self imagined. The initial act of resistance is therefore gentle. It is noticing the moment where obligation overrides desire. It is observing the polite yet suffocating performance of competence. It means pausing before answering the phone call or before clicking on the next email and simply asking a single internal question. Am I doing this because I genuinely wish to, or am I doing this because I fear disappointing someone else? This questioning becomes a muscle. At first, it aches. To question deeply is to dismantle assumptions that have provided structure, a predictable comfort even if that comfort is merely an illusion of safety. We become uncomfortable with our own lack of immediate answers, forced into the void of pure, unscripted being. The journey begins by mastering the art of the deliberate pause. Not a nap, not a break taken for comfort, but a conscious cessation of momentum simply to gather information from within oneself. When the external world demands that we accelerate, the deadline looms, the social event requires performance, we must practice forcing stillness. To stop in the middle of the rush is an act of radical sovereignty. This pause serves as a psychological circuit breaker. It interrupts the automatic loop of reaction and allows for genuine observation. In those seconds of forced nothingness, we begin to detect the subtle dissonance, the gap between what our hands are doing, what our mouths are saying, and what our quiet core heart is truly longing for. The weight lifts marginally, simply because we have located its anchor point. And that anchor point leads us into an exploration of ownership. We must learn to distinguish rigorously between desires that belong entirely within the borders of our own being, the deep-seated curiosity, the unique creative impulse, the sudden urge to learn a forgotten language, and those urges that were planted by culture or by parental expectation. The weight we carry is often composite, part obligation, part inherited dream, and part societal role. To begin living genuinely means accepting that much of what has been assigned to us, our careers, our expected marital paths, even certain deeply held moral viewpoints, is not intrinsically ours. It is borrowed. It was passed down like a mantle. We must now decide if we want to wear. The work here is neither revolutionary nor instantaneous. There are no grand pronouncements that cure the years of misalignment. Instead, we cultivate micro-rebellions, refusing to engage in small talk about trivial topics when the heart yearns for deeper connection, spending an unaccounted hour observing a single corner store window, or choosing not to respond immediately to every incoming digital demand. These actions are quiet declarations of self-priority. They tell the external world, and more importantly, they tell the internal one, that our primary allegiance is to genuine alignment, regardless of what that might cost in immediate social currency. It is a gradual shedding, not of skin, but of conditioned response. The empty space left by discarded expectations, while initially unsettling, becomes fertile ground. It allows us to finally hear the fainter, truer voice beneath the roar of should and must. This slow process of divestment is the true path back to self-sovereignty. We have learned to recognize the phantom weights we carry. We know that the rhythm of others' expectations has often set our own pulse, forcing us through motions dictated by the clock or the perceived demands of a career path. The subtle rebellion of noticing what belongs to another is merely step one. True freedom begins when we are willing to stop the motion entirely, to pause. This concept, the pause button principle, is not about luxury. It is a necessity for survival in a world demanding constant output. Our modern lives reward movement, speed, and distraction. Stillness feels unproductive, almost irresponsible. We have been trained to fill every gap between tasks, from checking a message immediately upon waking to listening only with our minds already formulating the reply. These gaps were once moments of deep thought. Now they are merely blank screens to be filled with scrolling or minor anxieties. But what if we rejected that programming? What if, in the midst of profound chaos, the frantic rush hour, the meeting derailed by interruption, the exhausting demands of a complex task, we simply chose to cease, to implement the intentional pause? The immediate effect of this choice is always internal panic. The mind treats stillness like an emergency. It scrambles to find something to do, anything to occupy the newly liberated neural space. We feel the urge to justify our inaction, to fill the silence with noise. A quick thought, a remembered detail, a low-level worry about tomorrow. This resistance is the ingrained habit of hyperproductivity, taught to us since childhood that doing equals being valuable. To pause means confronting the sheer emptiness of unstructured time, and that emptiness can feel frightening. The pause button principle requires treating stillness not as the absence of activity, but as a profound act of self-reclamation. It is rebellion against the tyranny of momentum. When we stop, we force a critical distance between external stimuli and internal reaction. We are pulling back from the relentless current of shoulds and musts. In that quiet microsecond of refusal, of deciding to just breathe for 3 full seconds, we interrupt the automatic chain reaction of stimulus response. This pause gives us sovereignty over our immediate emotional state, allowing us to observe the wave of anxiety wash over us without immediately being carried by it. We move from reacting out of habit to responding out of conscious choice. This practice must be integrated into the very fabric of chaos. It is not enough to wait for a tranquil retreat. We must force the interruption at the worst possible times. When the email inbox screams, when criticism descends unexpectedly, or when the pressure to perform feels like an actual physical weight on our chest. We learn to recognize the bodily markers of tension, the shallow breath taken while speaking another's words, the tightness in the shoulders that suggests holding a burden that isn't ours. The pause button principle teaches us to metabolize moments. Instead of rushing from one event to the next, we are learning to inhabit the present moment fully and deliberately. It is the space between thoughts where genuine insight can surface. It is recognizing the physical difference between truly breathing, a deep breath that engages the diaphragm, expanding the entire ribcage, and merely gasping for air while maintaining a stressful rhythm. By mandating this deeper inhale and slow exhale, we are physically training our nervous system to detach from the adrenaline economy of perpetual crisis. We are signaling to the body that, right now, in this specific moment, danger is absent, and therefore rapid action is not required. This intentional stopping point serves as a philosophical anchor. It is the place where the ego, the part of us obsessed with doing, achieving, or proving, is momentarily sidelined. We are forced into the posture of pure being, and in that state of pure being, clarity emerges. The true weight of expectations does not dissolve when we pause. Rather, our ability to view them changes. They lose their immediate urgency and gain a measurable distance. They become observable concepts rather than binding laws. The initial commitment is difficult because the culture of speed views stillness as failure. It requires micro-rebellions, pausing at a red light just to notice 5 things you have never noticed before, stopping conversation mid-sentence just to listen to the subtle nuances in another person's tone, rather than waiting for your turn to speak, taking 5 minutes during a workday not to plan or organize, but simply to observe one fixed point, a tree outside, a crack in the wall, and let your mind wander freely without judgment. These seemingly small halts accumulate into genuine shifts of power. The pause button principle is fundamentally about making room for deliberation. It is establishing an inner buffer zone between the external demand and our internal core self. We are learning that our reaction does not have to be proportionate to the event. The momentary stop grants us the philosophical luxury of choosing acceptance over resistance or empathy over judgment. It turns a forced outburst into a measured response. It transforms panic into deliberation. This capacity for pause becomes the first true sign of self-mastery, realizing that even when life demands continuous motion, we carry within us the absolute authority to choose otherwise, just for a single breath. And in mastering that moment of suspended animation, We begin to rewrite the script of a life governed by our own deliberate will. We have spent time confronting the weight of external expectations and finding the necessary radical pause within the chaos of modern life. We learned that merely reacting is to surrender our inner sovereignty. But true reinvention requires turning inward, deeper than just breathing through a stressful moment. It demands mapping the internal landscape, the intricate terrain of our own minds. And on this map, we inevitably find a figure we know too well, yet barely acknowledge, the inner critic. This is not merely a voice. It is often a finely tuned habit, an overdeveloped system of self-judgment that speaks in whispers of inadequacy and fear of the future. It dictates what we should be, who we should become, and most powerfully, what we must never risk being. For years, we have treated this critic as if it were some external adversary to be silenced or fought off with brute force logic. We try to argue against its sharp pronouncements. I am enough. I will succeed. These are valiant efforts, but confrontation is rarely the answer when dealing with deeply ingrained mental habits. To fight a voice only amplifies its presence. The shift begins with recognizing that the inner critic is less like a villain and more like an old, overprotective relative. It believes it is serving us by keeping us safe from potential pain, the failure of others, the disappointment of loved ones, or the perceived harshness of reality. Its pronouncements are rooted in fear, a protective mechanism that has served its purpose through times of genuine danger, but which now functions as an unnecessary guardrail on the open road of our lives. To map it is to treat it not as truth, but as data. We begin by observing its patterns without judgment. When does it speak loudest? Is it when we consider starting a new project, when we face genuine professional uncertainty? Or perhaps most frequently, in quiet moments when the demands of others are finally silent? The critical exercise is moving from internalizing its statements to observing them. Instead of accepting the phrase, "You are not smart enough for this," as a declaration about your inherent value, we learn to acknowledge it simply as, "I am having the thought that I am not smart enough for this." This subtle shift in language is profoundly powerful. It creates necessary distance between the thought and the self. The thought becomes an object of study, rather than a fundamental truth of identity. We realize that the voice belongs to a pattern, a habit loop established by past hurts or cultural narratives we absorbed long ago. What we are mapping here is not just negative thoughts. It is the underlying script that assigns blame and limitations. It dictates, if you fail, it proves your worthlessness. If you rest, it proves you are lazy. If you need support, it proves you cannot stand alone. These scripts form the architecture of self-doubt, constructing walls around a potential life. The work becomes gentle dialogue, an act less of refutation and more of compassionate curiosity. When the critic erupts with certainty, demanding immediate compliance or self-punishment, we pause. We breathe deep, utilizing that stillness learned in Chapter 3. And then, instead of arguing, we ask it a clarifying question. For instance, what fear are you trying to protect me from right now? Or, on what evidence is this statement truly based, and does that evidence account for the possibility of growth or change? The dialogue with the critic must be consistent. It requires us to gently challenge its premise of absolute certainty. We treat it not as reality, but as a hypothesis proposed by an overcautious mind. This practice is immensely tiring, because it demands that we operate against the force of years of learned emotional response. Mapping this inner territory also forces us into moments of radical vulnerability. When we fully map the limitations we believe to be true, the sheer weight of those constraints becomes visible. We see how many potential paths, the creative venture, the deep relationship, the profound change in career, we have unconsciously preempted because of a single self-limiting belief. I don't deserve that much peace. Or, I am too old to start again. These are declarations of failure placed on ourselves before we even begin. The purpose of this meticulous mapping is not merely self-help. It is philosophical deconstruction. It is the methodical dismantling of inherited narratives so that we can rebuild a foundation based on genuine, sustainable belief. We are learning to separate our lived experience from the commentary provided by our critical inner mechanisms. Our worth cannot be derived from external metrics of achievement, nor should it be dictated by the harshest voice inside our own skulls. The greatest liberation found in mapping this critic is recognizing that its judgments are not predictors of future reality. They are only artifacts of past anxiety. By naming them, observing their rhythm, and questioning their certainty, we begin to reclaim a space previously occupied by fear and inadequacy. This mapped terrain becomes the foundation for true self-mastery, knowing not just what we want, but understanding exactly what internal mechanism is trying to convince us that it is impossible. This process of conscious mapping, of seeing the critic as an overly diligent student who has memorized obsolete rules, is foundational. It prepares the ground for the next great act of freedom, choosing where our attention falls. If we do not first understand the mechanisms that restrict our thought, we cannot possibly choose a different path for it to take. We have spent time examining the silent weights we carry, the expectations placed upon us by others. We learned to pause when the world demanded speed, finding a deep breath amidst the chaos of routine. We mapped the treacherous landscape of the inner critic, recognizing its sharp pronouncements not as truth, but as ingrained habit, a powerful resistance pattern. Each step has required an act of gentle rebellion against our automatic response. Yet, all this introspection leads us to one simple, profound truth, that our attention is not merely a resource. It is the currency of consciousness itself. It is the most finite, precious thing we possess. Consider your focus. Where does it travel during a single day? Does it leap immediately to the anxieties of tomorrow? Does it linger on mistakes made yesterday? Or is it grounded in the rich complexity of the present moment? To live authentically requires nothing less than becoming master of where we direct our light, where we focus our inner gaze. This chapter is about claiming that sovereignty through attention. It is not enough simply to stop reacting. We must begin intentionally selecting what we allow ourselves to observe. The world constantly attempts to hijack our gaze. Every notification flashing on a screen, every headline screaming across the digital void, every comparison flickered by an acquaintance's perfect life online. These are all sophisticated mechanisms designed to siphon off your mental energy. They convince you that suffering requires witnessing, or that worth is determined by measurable engagement. The mind, being naturally associative and prone to pattern recognition, will seek out conflict and novelty because those states feel urgent. But urgency rarely equates to meaning. True meaning demands stillness, a quiet, unblinking awareness that can hold contradictory thoughts without collapsing into judgment. We must learn the deep philosophical discipline of selection. To choose attention is to draw a sacred boundary around your inner world. It means deciding, moment by moment, what deserves the richness of your thought and what should be allowed to pass, unnoticed, like dust motes in a shaft of sunlight. This choice is terrifying because it requires radical trust in oneself. It asks us to accept that letting go of worry or assumption might feel unearned or simply boring. Yet, within that space, the spacious quiet created by the act of omission is where true freedom resides. Freedom from obligation, freedom from historical narrative, and most profoundly, freedom from self-imposed anxiety. Imagine your attention as a finely crafted lens. If you allow it to wander aimlessly, blurring across traffic, debt fears, and societal comparison, the resulting image is chaotic and distorted. But if you deliberately focus that lens, directing its beam only onto what matters right now, onto the task at hand, or onto the quiet miracle of breathing, the clarity is stunning. It allows us to see reality not through a filter of fear, but through a prism of acceptance and possibility. We must train this ability with relentless commitment. This training begins by observing the pull. Observe the moment you automatically click on something negative because it feels familiar or urgent. Pause. Name that impulse for what it is. Mere habit, merely reaction. Then, gently guide your focus elsewhere. Redirect it to the feel of the chair beneath you, to the distinct scent of coffee, to the steady rhythm of your own heart beating against your ribs. This simple redirection is a profound act of will. It rewires the pathways of the mind. We are moving from passive recipients of stimulus to active curators of our internal reality. When we master this choice, we begin to build resilience not merely in the face of inevitable difficulty, but even in the mild disappointment of stillness. Because when your attention is disciplined and focused only on what you choose to engage with, external events lose their inherent power to destabilize you. A sudden setback at work no longer feels like a personal indictment. It is simply data, an observation point for recalibration. The weather report can scream about hurricanes or droughts, but if our focus remains rooted in the present discipline of being here, we remain anchored. We learn that external variables are, by definition, uncontrollable and therefore should not be given perpetual intellectual tenancy. This selective attention allows us to decouple events from meaning. It is a philosophical act akin to accepting the facts of nature. The sun rises whether we wish it or not. The market fluctuates regardless of our deepest hopes. Our response must reflect this detached wisdom. We are no longer arguing with reality, nor are we perpetually running toward some imagined future state of perfect contentment. Instead, we are perfecting the art of observing reality as it simply is, acknowledging its transient nature, while simultaneously valuing the richness and momentary perfection of the present moment. This continuous practice of attention forms the bedrock upon which all subsequent self-mastery will be built. It is the foundation stone for a life built not on reaction, but on intention. We have learned to observe the burdens placed upon us, recognizing the silent tyranny of expectations. We paused amidst chaos, learning that the mere act of stopping, of choosing stillness over reaction, is a profound act of self-sovereignty. We found the whispers of the inner critic and began to treat those critical thoughts not as truth, but as merely patterns passing through the mind's architecture. Then we mastered attention itself, recognizing it as the most valuable currency of the consciousness. We learned that by choosing where to focus our gaze, we gain the power to detach ourselves from anxiety and worry. All of this has prepared us for a fundamental understanding, the boundary between what is ours to command and what belongs entirely to the indifferent sweep of the world. The true weight of life's challenges often lies in resisting reality itself. We instinctively want to fight bad traffic. We feel the urge to change another person's difficult decision, or we become frustrated by a rainy day that disrupts our perfect plans. This impulse to resist is natural, but it is also one of the greatest sources of suffering. It demands that our inner peace be dependent on external perfection. And this dependency, fundamentally, leaves us utterly powerless. To begin reinventing ourselves means accepting this ultimate limitation, that there are things, the actions of others, the economy's unpredictable curve, nature's cycles, or even simply bad luck, that fall entirely outside the scope of our will. These external forces do not care about our inner peace, nor do they respond to our diligent planning or our best intentions. They merely are. Our philosophy must therefore pivot from mastery over the world to mastery over ourselves in relation to the world. This understanding is profoundly liberating, yet counterintuitive. It asks us to surrender the comfortable illusion of control, to willingly give up the exhausting struggle against what simply cannot be altered in the moment. This is not passive resignation. It is active acceptance. Acceptance is not saying that a wrong thing has happened and hoping it wasn't true. Rather, it is acknowledging reality exactly as it presents itself, seeing the situation for what it is, stripped of our immediate emotional resistance. Consider the philosophical difference between needing something to change and understanding that changing it is outside your jurisdiction. When we feel immense frustration in a delay, the natural response is anger, railing against the clock or the inconvenience. This struggle consumes enormous mental energy without altering the reality of the traffic jam. The Stoic practice teaches us instead to observe the event neutrally, an external occurrence. We are trained to recognize the sphere of our own influence and draw a careful boundary around it. What do I genuinely control? Only my internal response. That is the sole domain where true freedom resides. The goal becomes developing what we call the dichotomy of control. This mental framework helps us sort every concern, every frustration, every worry into two distinct columns. Column A, things outside our control, and column B, things within our control. When anxiety strikes, perhaps concerning a professional outcome or a relationship's future, we must mentally force that query into those columns. If it belongs in column A, we practice the art of non-attachment to its outcome. We accept it as an indifferent fact of life. The challenge is immense because human emotion craves drama and resolution. Our minds are trained by culture to believe that effort equals guaranteed reward, and predictability equals safety. To embrace acceptance means embracing uncertainty. It means finding a deep calm not because the storm has passed, but because we have built an internal anchor strong enough to withstand any kind of wind. The process requires us to view resistance itself as a form of suffering. Resisting something external is merely adding a second layer of pain, the frustration of fighting against natural law or human reality. We are therefore guided toward flow. To truly live in alignment, we must learn to move with the river of events, understanding that sometimes the current takes us somewhere unexpected, and our task is not to force the raft back upstream, but simply to stabilize ourselves upon it. This stillness amidst the inevitable flux becomes the source of profound resilience. This mastery over acceptance does not mean becoming emotionally numb or indifferent to injustice. It means purifying our focus. We can feel deep compassion for the suffering of others and take purposeful action against genuine wrongdoing. But we must first shed the crippling internal expectation that effort alone is sufficient to eliminate all sources of pain. Some pains are simply a natural consequence of being alive in an unpredictable, complex world. The final act of this profound intellectual journey is therefore one of radical peace with limitation. It is accepting the inherent messiness of existence, the unpredictability of others, the indifference of fate, and the sheer complexity of reality itself. Only when we relinquish our futile desire to dictate the terms of every single external event can we truly become masters of the self. We stop expending energy attempting to change the climate and start dedicating that enormous power inward. building an unshakable fortress of calm, where the only force acting upon us is the mindful choice of our own being. We have traveled far from the comfortable numbness of autopilot. We learned to see the invisible weight of expectations and found the rebellion in a simple pause. We mapped the treacherous landscape of our inner critic, realizing that the voice judging us is often just a habit speaking loudly. Then, we mastered attention itself, recognizing it as the most precious resource we possess. We faced the great challenge of acceptance, drawing the line between what we can truly control and what must simply be allowed to happen. The work has been profound, deep in the quiet architecture of our own minds. But reinvention is not a single battle won, nor is it a dramatic sprint toward a perfect destination. It is structure. It is pattern. If consciousness is movement, then habits are its geometry. To change who we are, we must begin by understanding how we operate moment to moment. We must look at the scaffolding of our days, the invisible lines that guide our actions before we even realize they are guiding us. The true secret to transformation lies in realizing that a habit is not merely an isolated action. A single choice does not exist in a vacuum. Every single small repetition feeds into something larger, a pattern, a geometric structure that dictates the whole design of your life. Think of it like building with meticulously cut stones. Each stone seems small on its own, easily overlooked, but when arranged together over time, they create an unshakable edifice. And if you change the way you place just one cornerstone, the stress shifts through the entire structure, reshaping the walls and the foundation. This is the geometry of habits. It suggests that to truly reinvent yourself, we cannot simply try harder on a single virtue, or willpower alone will sustain us. We must address the underlying patterns, the geometric relationships between our actions, our thoughts, and our reactions. Our lives are not merely collections of choices, they are interlocking systems. The work begins with observation, an almost scientific detachment. Before we can reshape anything, we must draw a careful map of what currently exists. We observe the routine wake-up sequence. Is it fueled by immediate anxiety about work? Does the thought pattern jump from task to worry without pause? Do you reach for your phone immediately before even pouring that first cup of coffee? These small triggers are the coordinates of your current self. They reveal the ingrained pathways of response. And then we look at resistance. We often assume that profound change requires monumental effort, a radical overhaul in a single night. This is false. Resistance tends to overcorrect, leading to burnout and despair. The deeper wisdom reveals that gentle pressure, applied consistently at key nodes, achieves more than sudden brute force. It is about the microscopic adjustments. Consider the seemingly trivial act of reading for 10 minutes before engaging with any demanding input from the world. This choice might seem inconsequential against the backdrop of a career or family commitment, but it creates a structural fracture in your existing pattern. By introducing this small space, this pocket of self-directed calm, you disrupt the established flow. You are not changing your entire life. You are altering the geometry around one single part of it. Or imagine the habit of pausing before speaking in anger or before reacting to a sharp email. Instead of letting the initial spike of emotion, the adrenaline, take over and guide your response immediately, you insert that calculated delay. That breath, that mandatory 5-second gap. This pause is not merely emotional regulation. It is an act of architectural redesigning within the self. It prevents an old, deeply set pattern from completing its circuit. The potential for reaction was always there, but now the geometry demands a conscious interruption. The beauty and power here are radical. We move away from the idea that we are slaves to instinct or societal expectation. Instead, we recognize ourselves as architects of our own daily rhythms. By understanding how one small pattern feeds into the next, how procrastination on Monday cascades into worry by Wednesday, which then justifies poor sleep on Thursday, we can identify the weakest point in the entire structure. And at that point, we apply our radical honesty, not with self-judgment, but with profound curiosity. We ask, what if I break this link? What if I treat this seemingly insignificant moment as a non-negotiable boundary of my own time and attention? The understanding of geometry gives us immense power because it makes the process manageable. It removes the paralyzing weight of becoming everything new, instantly. Instead, we focus on incremental shifts. We see the pattern. The alarm goes off, I reach for my phone, I start scrolling, my mind becomes anxious about unseen demands. The geometric intervention is simple. Alarm goes off, I sit up and take 3 deep breaths in bed, then, slowly, deliberately, I open one eye at a time. This changes the entire gradient of your morning. It retunes the system from an anticipatory state of stress to one of grounded awareness. This process requires tireless vigilance, the consistent practice of noticing the tiny shifts, noticing when you are about to criticize another person, and intercepting that thought with a memory of compassion. Noticing when your natural inclination is to avoid rest because it feels inefficient, and choosing instead to honor that stillness. Every single successful interruption of an old pattern gains momentum. It strengthens a new pathway in the mind, much like reinforcing a supporting beam in a building. We are learning to live not by reaction, but by careful design. We are moving from being occupants within a life handed to us, guided by unseen geometric constraints, to becoming the master builders of our own existence. The geometry suggests that transformation is less about massive breakthroughs and more about perfect continuity, the unwavering dedication to those small, structural changes until they become the natural state of being. The deepest freedom we seek is not geographical or financial. It is structural. It is the internal mastery over the rhythm itself. To choose the sequence, to define the space between thought and action, and to build a pattern, a daily, breathing routine, that aligns precisely with the values you have so carefully defined. It is this deliberate, disciplined structure that finally allows us to stand completely self-possessed, having rebuilt ourselves from the quiet persistence of small, geometric acts. The final frontier of self-mastery is not finding something new to do. It is learning what not to do. It is the profound power contained within a single, simple refusal. We have journeyed from confronting the exhausting mirror and shedding the weights of others' expectations. We learned the necessity of intentional stillness, pausing before reacting, thereby retrieving control of our nervous system. We mapped the constant chatter of the inner critic, transforming judgment into mere observation. Then we mastered the choice of attention itself, realizing that where we focus is the deepest act of freedom. From there came the quiet wisdom of recognizing what lies outside the domain of our own will, the acceptance that flowing with reality often requires surrendering the need for absolute control. We learn to observe habits not as rigid structures, but as pliable geometries, understanding that small acts of gentle disruption could ripple through an entire life pattern. Every step was a conscious rebellion against autopilot. But today, we arrive at the simplest, yet most powerful act, the boundary, the power of no. To say no is often interpreted as loss or even as resistance. We see it as neither of those things. It is not rejection, it is definition. A no to something extraneous is a resounding yes to yourself. Think back to the relentless pull of obligations, the polite murmurs of commitments made for the sake of harmony. These small agreements, these gentle yeses, are the silent architects of our fatigue. They build lives around the desires and schedules of others. We convince ourselves that saying yes means being good or necessary or agreeable. But every single instance where we sacrifice a moment of inner peace to avoid discomfort chips away at our core resource, our personal energy. It depletes the wellspring required for genuine reinvention. Reclaiming self-sovereignty therefore requires an economy of commitment. We must become meticulous stewards of our most precious, finite resource, our time and our attention. This necessitates the deployment of a shield, a powerful linguistic mechanism that is simply no. The first fear associated with this boundary setting is the perceived conflict. What if we disappoint someone? What if their disappointment causes a rift? Our deep human need for belonging makes us conditioned to prioritize external approval over internal truth. We have internalized the belief that worth must be validated by participation, that if we are not doing something or committing to someone else, then perhaps we do not matter. But this is the deepest miscalculation of all. To say no does not diminish your value, it elevates it. It acts as a clarifying filter for your life. When you refuse an obligation that drains you without nourishing you, you are performing a radical act of internal alignment. You are saying, my capacity to be whole belongs solely to me. Imagine the moment of practice. Perhaps it is a social invitation that requires an emotional expenditure, better used in quiet contemplation. Or maybe it is a work project that promises visibility, but guarantees sleepless nights and misalignment with your values. The internal monologue begins its familiar protest. It suggests minimizing the refusal, softening the blow until the boundary nearly vanishes. You feel the physical pressure to acquiesce, to agree just to smooth over the moment's tension. But in this space of resistance, you must call upon the stillness we cultivated. Remember the pause button principle. Anchor yourself there. Use that breath, deep and deliberate, and speak your truth simply, without apology and without elaborate defense. The phrase itself requires no lengthy justification. It does not need an alibi. No, thank you. Or I cannot commit to that right now. These are complete sentences of self-respect. They function as philosophical statements in themselves. They declare the non-negotiable boundaries of your being. The consequences of this practiced refusal are profound. Initially, there might be mild friction. People accustomed to taking your yes for granted will feel a momentary ripple, a slight imbalance in their expected routine. This is natural. It is simply them adjusting to a new reality where you are no longer an endless resource. But as you continue the practice, something remarkable occurs. The people who genuinely value you, the ones whose affection is rooted in your being and not just your convenience, they will respect the boundary. They will accept the no because they understand that it safeguards your integrity. And more importantly, by practicing this self-limitation of commitment, you begin to redirect an enormous flow of stored energy back into yourself. You are building up a reserve, a private reservoir of time and attention, previously given away in tiny, invisible installments. This newly reclaimed space is sacred. It is the fertile ground where genuine reinvention takes root. It allows you to allocate your limited resources, your focus, your emotional depth, your waking hours, only toward those pursuits that align perfectly with your deepest self-definition. Mastering the no ultimately becomes the ultimate form of radical permission. It is permission to prioritize rest over obligation, passion over popularity, and truth over convenience. It grounds you in a quiet certainty. The most profound act of care you can show anyone else is first giving yourself that same radical respect. This boundary is not a wall built against the world. It is an architecture constructed around your core self. A gentle structure designed for longevity and sustainable peace. By guarding this power, you ensure that the beautiful life waiting for you on the other side of reinvention remains yours alone to claim. It awaits nothing less than your fully engaged presence. We have traveled far from the weight of expectation and the relentless ticking of time. We learn to pause amidst chaos, finding sovereignty in stillness. We trained our attention, understanding that focus is the truest currency of self. We embrace the difficulty of accepting what we cannot control, realizing that resistance is merely suffering disguised. But true reinvention does not require constant, dramatic struggle. It demands something quieter, something deeper, a subtle retuning of the soul's senses. It asks us to look away from the grand epiphany and toward the ordinary, the unremarkable, the fleeting beauty of a single moment passing by. We often treat joy like a distant destination, believing that profound happiness only arrives after monumental achievement or dramatic life change. We wait for the perfect moment, the ideal circumstance, the sign that everything has finally aligned. Yet, philosophy teaches us that waiting is often an act of self-imposed delay. It keeps us suspended in perpetual longing. The mastery we seek today is not one of grand gestures, but of radical appreciation. It is the art of finding the profound within the pedestrian. The quiet dignity of a simple routine becomes the training ground for a life lived intentionally. We have walked through the necessity of stopping, of challenging expectations, and learning to anchor ourselves in the present moment. We began by recognizing the exhaustion beneath the mirror's reflection, acknowledging that much of our struggle was dictated not by fate, but by unexamined habits, by inherited scripts we ran on autopilot. The subsequent steps taught us where true power resides, not in controlling external events, for those remain stubbornly outside the scope of our will. Instead, they reside within the quiet space between stimulus and response, in the choice of our attention itself. We learn to set boundaries with the word no, reclaiming energy that had been freely given away simply out of a desire to be agreeable or needed. If reinvention is a process, then it must ultimately lead to an internal conversation, a dialogue. This chapter is not about finding external answers. It is about mastering the questions we ask ourselves and listening deeply for the quiet truths that wait beneath the noise of our daily lives. The dialogue with self requires us to move beyond mere thought processes and into a state of deep, unflinching self-inquiry. It is an arduous work of purification, demanding that we become both the relentless investigator and the gentle guide. We must sit with the hardest questions, those that hold no immediate comfort and demand vulnerability. At its core, this dialogue asks us to confront the deepest layer of our values. What do we genuinely believe matters? Is it status? Is it material accumulation? Or is it something quieter? Perhaps the deep satisfaction of integrity, the richness of genuine connection, or simply the quiet freedom that comes from self-trust. The danger here is intellectualizing. It is easy to list desired virtues, calmness, generosity, resilience, and feel satisfied with that inventory. But philosophy is not a checklist. It is a lived reality. The true weight of the dialogue lies in examining how these stated values conflict with our automatic actions, how they are betrayed by our rushed responses when faced with stress, disappointment, or criticism. We must ask, When did I last act contrary to my best self? What was the circumstance that made me compromise my core truth for temporary comfort or perceived acceptance? The initial tendency is often defensiveness. We want to answer quickly, to offer a neat, respectable version of ourselves, the persona we believe others expect us to maintain. But the dialogue with self demands we drop that protective mask entirely. It requires adopting the attitude of radical curiosity. Instead of judging the parts of our past selves or current habits as failures, we approach them as data points. We treat those contradictions not as moral flaws, but as information, signals pointing toward an area needing deeper understanding. The process involves structuring moments of intentional reflection, whether through disciplined journaling or silent meditation. These times are sacred spaces carved out against the relentless tide of obligation. They serve as anchors to prevent us from simply drifting back into reactive living. When we write, or when we sit in silence, the questions must be relentlessly honest. We cannot accept superficial answers regarding our deepest motivations. Why do I fear solitude? Is it because I equate self-sufficiency with loneliness? Why is my time spent consuming entertainment often more comforting than the quiet challenge of doing nothing at all? The impulse to fill every moment is a powerful enemy, for boredom is the fertile soil where genuine understanding takes root. The internal conflict revealed in this dialogue is profound. We confront the chasm between who we claim to be and how we actually behave when the pressure is off. Perhaps our articulated values include compassion and empathy, but the moments of exhaustion reveal a desperate impatience with emotional depth, preferring quick fixes or surface-level engagement. This chapter teaches us that self-knowledge is not a final destination, but an escalating conversation, a committed state of mindful listening. It is learning to tolerate the discomfort of ambiguity, the feeling of being unformed, because freedom itself is often messy and undefined in the early stages. The dialogue requires us to forgive ourselves for the accumulated dissonance. We must treat our past selves with the same compassionate rigor that we apply to our future intentions. Forgiveness here is not a gesture. It is an active release, letting go of guilt as a means to reclaim forward momentum. It allows us to accept our incompleteness and recognize that growth is inherently uneven, marked by stumbles and periods of relapse. Ultimately, the conversation with self solidifies the foundation for everything that follows. By truly knowing ourselves, our fears, our desires, our persistent patterns of compromise, we gain the foundational wisdom needed to build a life architecture that finally mirrors the inner landscape we are working so hard to cultivate. This deep dialogue transforms us from passive participants in a predetermined script into conscious authors of our own existence. The journey of reinvention is often framed by the language of triumphant moments, the grand breakthrough, the sudden realization. We are taught to view failure as a verdict, a judgment placed upon our worth that suggests fundamental inadequacy. We feel the sting of setback like a deep wound, believing it proves we were never meant for what we desired. But if the true goal is self-authorship, a life built on internal integrity rather than external applause, then we must fundamentally change how we process falling short. The greatest misconception about effort and failure is that they are opposites. They are not. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is merely information. It is data. The journey toward a new self is rarely marked by thunderous epiphanies or dramatic declarations. Instead, it unfolds in the quiet gravity of definition, in the slow, painstaking act of choosing what you truly stand for. You have spent chapters questioning expectations, mastering your attention, recognizing the limits of control, and gently observing the patterns of old habits. Now comes the hour of articulation, defining the internal constitution that will guide every choice going forward. The previous work was primarily investigative, a deep excavation of the self to find its raw components. It was about gathering data points, acknowledging the weight you carried for others, identifying the narratives whispered by the inner critic, and separating fact from feeling. But knowledge itself is a fragile thing if it remains unanchored. If you do not give structure to your insights, they remain mere observations, unable to transform into lived reality. This chapter asks you to step back from the chaos of daily life, away from the urgent notifications and the competing demands for your focus. It requires stillness, a monumental effort after years of self-interrogation. This quiet moment is not an end point. It is the foundational act of engineering your personal philosophy, your core set of operating principles. A personal code is more than just a list of nice ideas. It is the internalized contract you sign with yourself. It is the framework that allows you to navigate inevitable conflict and confusion without losing yourself in the struggle. Think of it as an internal compass, calibrated not by social trend or momentary emotion, but by enduring, examined truth. When faced with difficult choices, when convenience tempts compromise, or fear whispers a familiar lie, your code must act as the immediate filter, providing clarity where external noise screams confusion. The work now is to isolate those non-negotiables. What virtues do you believe in fundamentally? Integrity, perhaps, because it means aligning your outward actions with your deepest internal beliefs, regardless of who is watching or what outcome is promised. Or maybe it is stillness, recognizing that true clarity only arrives when motion ceases. Perhaps it is curiosity, the commitment to remain perpetually open and humble before the vast mystery of experience. These are not arbitrary choices, they are philosophical commitments. You must question these potentials ruthlessly. Does courage simply mean taking risks? Or does it mean having the quiet fortitude to admit when you are wrong? Does compassion mean giving everything away? Or does it mean understanding where your own boundaries lie so that you do not burn out in service to others? The temptation is always toward the aesthetically pleasing, the trendy virtue. But a personal code must be brutally honest and profoundly personal. It cannot be what society suggests makes a good person. It must be what sustains you when all external structures collapse. Consider integrity again. It means that your words, your commitments, and your actions are one continuous narrative. If you publicly advocate for patience but privately lash out in frustration, the code is compromised. The journey of defining this structure requires holding up the painful mirror to any misalignment. It demands acknowledging moments where you have defaulted back into old, comfortable patterns, where reactivity has triumphed over considered virtue. This act takes courage because it forces a confrontation with your highest potential versus your current lived reality. You are not writing down ideals for platitudes. You are engraving operational mandates for your soul. These mandates must serve as anchors when the storms of life inevitably hit. They should dictate how you treat failure, how you respond to praise, and most importantly, how you spend your time and energy. The process is iterative. You will write a principle down. Say, I operate with radical honesty, and then immediately test it against memory. Where did I fail this week? In what moment was my dishonesty convenient? The code is not static. It is a living doctrine that requires constant self-interrogation and maintenance. It acknowledges the human tendency toward intellectualizing virtue while falling back on primal, emotional habit. The power of defining this personal contract lies in its ability to generate alignment. When your internal operating system, your values, matches your external behavior, your actions, a profound energy is released. That is the quiet force behind genuine self-mastery. It removes the exhausting, constant negotiation between who you feel like being and who you actually choose to be. The act of writing this code, of seeing it on paper, or merely committing it to deeply considered thought, transforms amorphous yearning into concrete direction. It takes vague desires for to be better and translates them into actionable, guiding principles. To approach struggle with intellectual rigor, to treat time as the most precious resource, to respond to emotional pressure with measured silence. This is the final internal architecture before you step fully out into the world of reinvention. You are building a scaffolding for the self that cannot be dismantled by criticism or circumstance. It is not an escape from life, but a framework for engaging with it authentically and powerfully. This code is your personal covenant, your definition of a meaningful existence. Write it down, commit to it fiercely, and let it become the quiet, unshakable truth at the core of everything you do. Having established the principles of internal sovereignty, the necessity of the pause, the focus on what we can control, and the power of defining our own personal code, we arrive at a different kind of transition. It is not a fiery explosion, nor a sudden dramatic departure. Instead, the journey towards self-mastery culminates in something far quieter, far more profound, a gentle exit. This quietude itself becomes an act of monumental courage. The previous chapters were dedicated to gathering tools, mapping habits, setting boundaries, and articulating truth. Chapter 12 demanded that we write down our core values, that we define the moral architecture of who we intend to be. But definition is only half the work, the other half is embodiment. The code must leave the page and inhabit the life. To begin this new phase requires a symbolic act of release. We must create physical or mental space for the self we are becoming. This gentle exit does not mean abandoning our lives, nor is it necessarily leaving a place or a person behind in a grand gesture of dramatic breakup. Rather, it means systematically and calmly closing chapters that no longer serve the integrity of our new personal code. The mind often attaches deep meaning to old routines, to worn furniture, to predictable suffering. We fear the blank space, the void left when familiar anchors are lifted. This attachment is based on comfort, not truth. The emotional weight we feel when anticipating a change is often misread as proof that what is ending was genuinely necessary or deeply loved. But perhaps it was only habituated. The act of gentle exit teaches us to treat the past not as a trauma requiring dramatic closure, but as a season that has simply run its course. We observe the objects, the commitments, and the emotional baggage associated with our former selves. We do not burn them in a ritual bonfire. We gather them gently and place them down. Imagine an old desk cluttered with papers representing years of unexamined obligation. Each stack represents a yes that was given out of fear, or a job title accumulated simply to satisfy external expectation. The gentle exit involves looking at those stacks one by one, recognizing the investment of time and energy, and then deliberately setting them aside. This is not failure, it is recognition. It is acknowledging that the chapter on this specific set of compromises has reached its natural end. The self we are building cannot be housed within the structural confines of who we were yesterday. The vessel must change to hold a different spirit. If your old life involved constant reaction, if you moved from crisis to crisis, then true reinvention requires creating distance, physical or emotional, from that frantic pace. We are not running away from anything. We are simply walking toward our center. This journey demands unburdening. It is a meditative process of decluttering the life and the mind. We look at the commitments on our calendar, the relationships defined by expectation rather than choice, and ask ourselves with unflinching honesty, does this still align with my personal code? Is this act of presence giving me true sovereignty, or am I performing an old role for applause? The initial resistance to separation is profound. The ingrained fear tells us that if we let go of the familiar pattern, even a negative one, we will be left adrift, exposed, and unprepared. This is where stoicism offers its clearest guidance. Suffering comes not from the external event itself, but from our judgment about it. Letting go is not a guarantee of pain. It is an act of trusting ourselves to navigate the unfamiliar landscape with grounded consciousness. We learn that freedom is synonymous with having nothing fixed in place. It means embracing the liquid state of potentiality. Our next chapter does not exist, and by accepting that profound uncertainty, we strip away the emotional adhesive holding us to outdated expectations. The old self was rigid. It needed certainty, no matter how false that certainty felt. But the new self must be fluid, adaptable, and willing to accept the unknown horizon. The gentle exit is ultimately an act of extreme acceptance of loss, acceptance of emptiness, and most importantly, acceptance of the future not knowing what it holds. It is a closing breath taken over a completed phase. With this calm finality comes the clean slate, not as an empty void, but as fertile ground. The seeds we plant next must be watered only by intentional awareness, protected from the accidental runoff of old habits and external pressures. We have done the internal work. Now, we execute the graceful movement forward. We have journeyed through the architecture of self. We learn to notice the expectations others placed upon us, recognizing the invisible weights we habitually carry. We mastered the sudden power of stillness, the pause button, transforming reactive motion into conscious choice. We met our inner critic not as a truth, but as an old, habituated friend that required gentle dialogue. Through choosing where to place our attention, we found the first frontier of true freedom, the sovereign right to notice and redirect our focus. And through recognizing the boundaries of what we can control, we learned the deep art of acceptance. These were not endpoints, merely necessary disciplines. The journey toward self-reinvention, however, is often mistaken for a grand, culminating victory, a moment when everything suddenly clicks into perfect alignment. But to view it that way is perhaps the deepest misunderstanding of all. The true nature of this work is something far quieter, far less dramatic. It is not a destination reached at dawn. It is the steady breath taken through the whole day. If Chapter 13 taught us the gentle art of letting go, of clearing space for what was to come, then Chapter 14 teaches us how to inhabit that space indefinitely. It is the shift from viewing personal growth as an event, a one-time overhaul, to understanding it as a continuous state of being. To truly reinvent oneself is not to become a fixed portrait. It is to learn the art of fluidity itself. The core message we must internalize now is this: reinvention is not a single great act, but an ongoing commitment. It is a sustained vigilance. Think of self-mastery not as conquering a mountain, but as committing oneself to the daily walk on the path up the mountain. The view from any single spot feels temporary. The effort lies in the steps themselves. The struggle now is with definition. We are tempted to believe that once we have defined our personal code, that set of core values and non-negotiable principles, the work will be done. We might think, since I know my truth, I am finished evolving. But this assumption is fragile. Life itself is a continuous source of variables, an endless river constantly shifting its banks. The moment we declare ourselves finished, we risk sinking into the seductive complacency that has plagued us throughout our lives. We must therefore embrace what Stoic philosophy calls virtuous effort, the acceptance that life is fundamentally cyclical. The moments of deep clarity after years of struggle will inevitably be followed by new temptations, unforeseen pressures, and sudden withdrawals back into old patterns. We cannot wait for perfect conditions to practice mindfulness, just as we cannot wait for freedom from stress to practice self-control. The continuous practice demands a radical shift in our relationship with mistakes. Failure is not simply data. It is part of the feedback loop that never truly closes. It is simply gravity, a constant reminder that nothing stays perfectly suspended or unchanged. When we inevitably stumble, when the ingrained habit pulls us back toward the old rhythm, the self-sovereign response is not self-recrimination, but gentle observation. We must greet the lapse with the same steady curiosity we use to observe a stranger's passing thoughts. This means integrating awareness into every mundane moment. It is in the checkout line that we practice noticing the internal rush of impatience instead of simply succumbing to it. It is while folding laundry or waiting for water to boil that we retrain our minds away from anticipating future anxieties and anchoring them firmly into the simple reality of the present sensory input. These moments are not filler. They are the core curriculum. We must learn the quiet resilience that comes from choosing the difficult path every single day. The discipline is not found in making massive, dramatic changes, like quitting a career or moving to a new continent, but in the accumulation of minuscule acts of intentionality. It is the microscopic choice to pause before reacting with anger. It is the deliberate decision to listen fully when distraction beckons us to formulate our reply. It is saying no gently, but firmly to an obligation that compromises who we are. The continuous practice requires cultivating a deep, unwavering self-compassion alongside absolute honesty. We must treat our past selves, the ones weighed down by expectations or crippled by criticism, with kindness. We acknowledge their genuine efforts under difficult conditions while simultaneously recognizing the superior capacity of the self observing them now. Forgiveness, in this context, is not an emotional gesture. It is a philosophical decision to cease fighting against who we once were and fully embrace whom we are becoming. The journey becomes less about fixing something broken and more about constantly tuning into the subtle hum of alignment. It is recognizing where our present actions, our spending of time, our attention, our words, are moving us toward the self we know we can become. If a thought or an activity pulls us sharply off course, like a boat caught by a strong undertow, we do not judge the pull. We simply observe it and patiently adjust the rudder back toward center. This lifelong commitment to being mindful is the ultimate reward of reinvention. It promises not effortless perfection, but sustainable grace. It offers the profound understanding that life itself is the most valuable continuous practice, a gentle dance between awareness and action. And in this unwavering dedication to the self, to showing up for oneself moment after moment, choosing presence over panic, and accepting change as the only constant, we finally find not just a better life, but a way of living fully attuned